I'm really excited to be presenting with you this afternoon around supporting your child during transitions and also routines. So I'm going to share my screen now and go through the presentation. Okay, so I'd just like to start by saying that in Australia, when we're doing presentations, we begin by acknowledging our traditional custodians of the land. So I'd like to do that to start with. So I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land from which I'm presenting today, and that's the Wadi Wadi people of the Dharawal Nation. And I would like to pay my respects to elders, past, present and emerging. I would also like to welcome all of you to this presentation this afternoon, and I'm hoping that there's going to be some really useful information for you in here that's going to help you to support your child during different routines in the home and different transitions. And we'll be talking about in the home and also a few things outside the home as well. So to start with, I would like to acknowledge the Abu Dhabi Early Childhood Authority as well, because we're really grateful to them for making this initiative a reality. So you can see on the screen there that this presentation is going to be approximately 30 minutes. And then after the presentation, there'll be a question and answer time, which will be approximately 20 minutes. So if you have questions as I'm presenting, please post the questions in the chat space. And then at the end of the presentation, I'll answer the questions. I won't be answering the questions during the presentation, just in case the content of the presentation does answer your questions anyway. So in that question and answer time, please feel free to ask some questions then in the chat space, or if you think of something as I'm presenting, you can certainly put it in the chat space, and if we don't cover it in the presentation, then I can get to it at the end. So we're going to start a little bit by talking about how we can support children with routines. And one of the things that I want to talk about first is that we often hear about a lot of the things I'm going to talk about in today's session. We hear about a lot of those for children who are on the autism spectrum. And while that is typically the group of children who are going to benefit most from these things, it doesn't mean that they're restricted just to that population. So if you have a child who maybe is just finding a routine hard, then these supports can be useful for them as well. So just so if you are in the group today and your child isn't on the autism spectrum, just so you know that this presentation is still going to be useful for them if they do have any difficulties around routines or transitions. So what I want you to do first of all is think about some of the routines that your child has some difficulty with, but also before you think about the things they're having difficulty with, we just need to think about what are some of the routines that your child might be involved in. Now, I'm just going to bring the handout up onto this screen, so just bear with me for a moment. So you have this handout that you can download if you haven't already done so. And I just want to refer to this for a moment. So this handout, I designed it, so I've put some examples in here, but then you can actually use this. You'll see that there's some spaces here. You can use this to put some information in there that is relevant to your own child. So I'm just going to refer to these examples first. So if you don't want to use this particular sheet, you can obviously use any kind of similar format to think about the routine and then think about the steps that are in the routine. Now, I've got two separate examples here, and the first one is a smaller task, so it's something specific, so getting dressed. Now, if you're thinking to yourself, that's not a small task for my child, that's why you think about it in itself as a routine. The second example, you can see there is a routine that involves a number of different things in the process of going to bed. So if we think about any particular routine in the day, what's a good thing for you to think about first is what is a routine that my child has in the day, and then break that down into smaller steps. So you can see that the task of getting dressed even putting the clothes on the bed that the child needs to get changed into, taking off the pajamas, putting on underwear, putting on a t-shirt, putting on shorts, putting on socks, and putting on shoes. Now, if your child, for example, taking off pajamas needs to be broken down again into smaller steps, then you can break this down. So you modify this according to your child's needs. The second example that's there is that bigger routine of actually going to bed. And you can see there that the things that I've listed down, putting your pajamas on, brushing your teeth, getting into bed, hugging your teddy bear, reading a story or singing a song, and then turning on the nightlight. Now, if, for example, brushing teeth in itself is difficult for your child, then that would be something you can put down as a routine, and then you can put all the steps in brushing teeth. So it might be a separate thing. So the idea is that you think really carefully about the things your child's having, what are some of the routines your child's engaged in, and then think about, are they having difficulty and how do I need to break this task down for them? So what I would really like you to do is just to pop in the chat space, any routine, so you can just write a one-word answer if you like, any routine that you think is a little bit difficult for your child. And we'll revisit some of those, as I said, at the end of the presentation. So what we're going to do is we're going to think about a whole lot of different supports that can assist your child with routines, and also that can assist your child with transitions. Because one of the things that is really hard in a routine is often the different steps that are taken. So when you move from one thing to the next. So it can be the transition between particular tasks during the day that the child has difficulty with, or we'll also talk about how you can use some of these supports for much bigger transitions. So for example, if you are going to the shopping centre, so that kind of transition, how we can use some of these supports. So the things that are listed on your screen are the things that I'm going to go through in this presentation. So we're going to start by discussing social stories. We're going to think about some of the visual support that might be useful to you for using with your child. The use of timers, the importance of making small changes, being very slow and steady with those changes and very consistent, allowing your child to have extra time, maybe visiting new places, but I'll talk about these more. We need consistency across all the people who are part of your child's world, and then how we manage those unexpected changes that are going to be things that might be difficult. Now, I'll just refer to this other handout, but I'm actually going to revisit this in question time if we have time then. So I will just show you this one here. So this is around supporting transition. So this is one of the handouts that you have, and it goes through a whole lot of different steps here, which are some of the things that we're going to be talking about today, just as a reminder. So I'm going to talk first about social stories and what social stories are, how you can use social stories, and also how you can create social stories. So social stories were developed back in the early 1990s by someone called Carol Gray. And she developed social stories as a way of teaching children about different social expectations. So this can be in relation to expectations around routines, or it might be even expectations around particular social behaviours that you're expecting from a child. So as we go through this idea of social stories, I want you to be thinking back to the routine that you just identified then. That might be something that's difficult for your child. But also, as you're going through, you might even think more in relation to a behaviour that your child has that isn't very socially appropriate, that you think a social story would support. So there's a range of use for social stories, and there's a range of different ways you can create them. But there's sort of some general ideas that I will go through. So to write a social story to start with, and this is just one example from this website, but there's loads of examples. You can Google social story templates, and you can actually often find templates that people have used or developed for you to use to create them. So what you're doing is you're thinking about what is a particular target skill or behavior or event, and that should be the title. So if it was, for example, getting dressed, that would be the title of the social story. So the child knows very clearly that this is about getting dressed. What you're doing is focusing on just one thing or event. So you don't want to have a social story that includes a lot of different things. And there's some reasons for that. One of the reasons is that you won't always do, a whole lot of different things in the same order. So if you create a social story, it's almost like you're bound for the order that you've put it in. So what you're doing is focusing on one particular thing at the time. So getting dressed, or brushing your teeth, or washing your hands, or it might be something more about going to grandma's house. So it's about then behaviours that you might expect, as well as routine things that will occur. You want to use pictures, and I'm going to talk a little bit later around visual supports and how there's a hierarchy of different visual supports. So you would use the correct visual support that was relevant to your child. So for example, you would start with using photos of your child in that routine. But pictures are really important to support the text, because pictures help the child to have a visual way as well as listening to the story. You want it to be a very simple format, so you don't want to clutter it up. Don't put lots of background colours or borders or things that can clutter the page up, but you also want it to be a very predictable sort of format. So you might even use the same language. So I get in the car, I get out of the car, I hold mum's hand. So having it a very simple format means it becomes very predictable for your child. So then, as I said before, you're breaking that event into small steps or small things, and that's what makes up the social story. You want to include the exact phrases or the scripts that you want either your child to say, if it's around behaviours or what they're going to be doing, or you want to use the same language that you would use with your child. So if, for example, you want your child to say, hello, grandma, even if your child's not verbal, you might still want them to say, hello, grandma. So you can say, and you would say, hello, grandma. And then they might have an approximation of what hello, grandma is. But then if you have a grandparent that you call by a different name, Nana, or another name, then that's where it's important you use the correct language. So the language that your child uses. You also want to be descriptive, but using very simple language. Answer the questions. So the what, the why, the where, those questions around the event or the thing. So you don't have to say, where is it? But you would say what it is, that where you're going, what you're going to be doing there. So all those work questions. You can describe how the child might react or how they might feel. So if, for example, you're developing a social story for going to the dentist, it might say, I feel scared when I go to the dentist. Because if you know that your child feels scared, so it's about how they might feel, but it's also then how they should react. So maybe it's about taking a deep breath or holding mum's hand or whatever it is. You want to talk about what the child should do, and where possible, keep the social story in the what you want them to do, not the what you don't want them to do. I have seen social stories, though, used effectively for something like at the shops. So if you don't want your child to pick up lollies, you might have a packet of like a picture of lollies with a cross through it. But if you can stick to what you want them to do, that's useful. So I mentioned before, keeping the language simple, positive, and you write it in first person. So it's I do this, I do that, and write it in present tense. So these are just some little pictures here for social stories. And again, there's some references there if you want to have a look at different examples. So you can see with the top one there, says, when I get angry, I sometimes hit mummy. This makes mummy sad. When I feel like hitting, I need to stop. I will hold my hands. I will take 5 big breaths. This helps me to stay calm. Mummy is happy when I am calm. So that's what your social story would look like. And that would be on individual pages, just like a story. You can do them as this kind of like story going from the left to the right, but sometimes that's a lot of information in one, in one visual lot for your child. So if you can have them on separate pages like a storybook, that's effective. So the bottom one there is about going to the doctors. So you can see that those steps are quite big steps. So Timmy's mum picks him up from school just like every other day. Timmy and his mummy are in the car. Now, this one, though, has been written for Timmy, but it's actually better if you say, my mum picks me up from school just like every other day. My mum will take me to. So it's written for the child. So the child's reading it for themselves. But this is just so you can see that sometimes they're written slightly differently. And you might know that for your own child, there's a different way that might work more effectively for them. So all of these things in my presentation and in anyone else's presentation, remember that you're the ones that know your child the best. So you can adapt all of this knowledge and content to what's going to work most effectively for your child. So I'm going to talk a little bit around visual supports now. And visual supports can be really, really basic. So you can, for example, if your child likes yellow or orange, you might decide that you're going to use something like this and you're going to draw. You might be quite good at drawing and you're going to, on this piece of paper, you're going to draw your child's pajamas. And then that's a visual support. So it doesn't need to be something more elaborate, but I am going to show you some examples both on the screen and I also have some examples here of different visual supports. There is a specific hierarchy for visual supports, which I will go through on the next page. Now, I put this link into the presentation as well because I will pass these slides onto the conference organisers so that they can upload those to the website. And this is actually a video that's about 15 minutes, which obviously because of the time constraints in this presentation, we can't watch it, but I've put the link there. And it's actually a video where a mum of a child on the autism spectrum is talking all about the kinds of visual supports she uses for her child, who I think is actually a teenager now. Different things she's used at different times. So she talks about using things like social stories, and she also talks about different visual supports that she has also used. So that might be something that you would like to have a look at. So I mentioned before around it being a hierarchy that you need to think about in relation to visual supports. And one of the things that we need to remember that for a lot of child, transferring their ideas is a challenge. Transferring what something looks like and recognising something else is similar is quite difficult. So, for example, you need to start with real objects. And when you start with real objects, you actually need the real object that your child uses. So I'm just going to give you some examples. If your child has drinks out of a cup, I just have a cup here. So if your child drinks out of this cup, this is the cup that you would need to take to your child and say, do you want a drink? So what you're doing is you're taking the cup that the child recognises as their own cup. If you show them a different cup or a glass or a plastic bottle, that might be very confusing for your child and they might not recognise it as the drink. So what you need to be doing is really thinking about how, what is it that my child uses, and then how can you make sure that you're using a similar thing. So same colour, same size. If your child understands that drink comes out of different plastic bottles, then you can use those different plastic bottles. if you wanted to, for example, change your child's nappy, then you might take the nappy over to the child, or diaper. I'm not quite sure which language you use. You would take that over to the child and say new nappy. So you're taking the actual nappy. So that's what we talk about with real objects. Then what you're doing is maybe miniatures of real objects. So if, for example, so there's a picture here of some bubbles, which could be a photograph of a real object, or it might be, that could be the bubble container that you take. It's a miniature version of a big bubble container that you might use with your child. But because you don't want to carry the big one all the time, or say if you want to give your child bubbles and you're outside of the house and you don't want to have the big one, then you would have a miniature to say, do you want some bubbles? So using the real objects in either their current place or a smaller version is the most important place to start. So I'm not sure if you'll be able to see this here, but this is actually a hand washing routine, and I'll just try and hold it up a little bit. But you can see here that this is using pictures, so you can see they're photographs of real objects, which is what we're using next. So these photographs are of the real objects. So it's the real tap, and this on the sink the child's using. It's the towel that the child's going to be using. So it's photographs of the real objects. Now this particular routine, you can see, also has little pictures in the bottom and also has the written word. So it's supporting these other things in the hierarchy. So in the hierarchy, it is talking about using the photographs, using line drawings, and then going to symbols and written words. I'm just realizing that you can't see me, you can only see my screen. So I'll show this to you at the end. I'll go off the screen share and I'll show you these examples. So what you have here is the pictures that are on the screen. You can also see that there's like a symbol, so that girl blowing the bubbles, or you can see there's the symbol of the bubbles. And the written word, it's always handy to use the written word as well, but your child may not necessarily get to be reading those written words until a lot later, but it will help to support the visual understanding that that when you're saying something, that you can actually have that in written form as well. So that hierarchy is really useful. So if your child's not understanding a photograph, go back to the real object. If they are understanding the real object, then you can go to the photograph and see if they understand that, and then go through to the next ones. So you can use these visuals for different routines that you have in your household. So you can see there's an example, so the bedtime one. So that first handout I showed you, where you're looking at a particular routine, then you can create a visual schedule or a visual timetable to support that as well. And these ones are just examples of bedtime routines, but you can see that there's different ways that they might be. So the one down the bottom that the child is pointing to are all individual little cards, and they can, as I said, be ones that you draw yourself or ones that you have made or purchased. The one that has that says my bedtime routine says evening jobs and then all done. The idea with this is that when the child's done it, then they move it down to the bottom. Now, this is okay if your child understands visuals, but to start with, what you would do is if they pick up the things in their bedroom, then you would take that off and actually remove that picture. So they're not distracted by whether they have to do it or they don't have to do it. Then when they have their bath, then you take that picture off and it goes away. So it can go into a finished box, or you can just put it into a little bag so that it goes away because it's completed. And then the next night, they're all back up in order in the way that your child needs them. So you can see there, this one here is using the actual drawings as well. So these other ones, these are other different ways that might work for you and for your child. So this one here, you might put this, laminate this, and then you might have a marker, a whiteboard marker, and then you actually can tick it off with your child. And then if it's been laminated, then you just wipe that clean for the next night. This one here is just, you go from the left to the right on each line. That's going to be very confusing though if a child's not really used to following a visual schedule. So you're much better to have it from left to right and very separate things, or from top to bottom, not doing this zigzag one like would be expected in here, because that can be very confusing. And this is an example of where you need the language that's relevant to your child. So, you know, if you call it a toilet, then don't write potty. Whereas if your child goes on a potty, or you have a nappy change, that's what goes in there. So you design the routine to suit what's going to work for your particular child. Now, timers can be really useful in terms of anticipating changes in the routine or those transitions. So these different ones you can see on the screen start with things like a clock that you might set an alarm, or you can set an alarm on your mobile, or you can actually, this kind of thing with the actual timer. So that's an app where there's the timer, so the child can actually see this red moving around. So it's the same as this one here. And this is called a time timer, which is an unusual name. But the time timer is, you can purchase these, but as I said, you can also do the same sort of thing. But with this, it allows the child to, it's red, and then the red will go away. And when it goes around to here, the alarm will ring, but the child visually can see the red getting smaller. Sand timers can be really useful for some children, because you can say, you know, when the timer goes off, or when the sand goes out, it's time to pack up the train. And what happens with this is you get your child to turn it over with you. And then when the sand's gone, you can show them that the sand's gone. So hopefully over time, your child then can use these themselves. This is much more useful than just saying in 5 minutes, we're going to do this. And these two timers here are different length timers. So this one, for example, might be 3 minutes, and this one might be 10 minutes. 10 minutes is very long, though, if for a warning for transitions, if your child does need support with that, because in that time they might have forgotten that you're going to actually be doing something different. So some of the tips around this is, what's really important is that you just make small changes, that you don't expect everything at once. So I've just written an example here that if you're talking about the bedtime routine for your child, and you know that your child really struggles with getting out of their clothes into their pajamas, and it's a nightly battle for you, what you might like to think about is doing one thing in that routine. Now, that might seem to you like it's not good enough, that you want the child to do the routine. But if you actually know that's too much for your child all at once, you might start by taking shoes off at night time and putting the shoes under the bed. And then the child just sleeps in their clothes, because that's enough for your child at that particular time. So you need to think about what is manageable for you, and also what is manageable for your child. And try not to be too swayed by either what your other children have previously done or what friends' children can do, because your child is unique. Every child is unique, and you need to be thinking about how you can support your child. So these little steps can then support your child to do things more easily down the track. So the other thing is that some children can use the visual and follow it as a whole thing. So taking their clothes off, putting their pajamas on, brushing their teeth. But as I said earlier, if you know that that's too hard for your child, just start with one small change. So just, it might be, you might use a visual just to take your shoes off. And then you think, well, just keep using that visual for taking shoes off and see how your child responds with it. And then if they seem to respond well with it, then you can incorporate them to some of the other things. So you need to make sure that you are slow and steady. Take extra time. So if you're going to a new place with your child, they might need extra time and extra support to be able to do that. So I'd just like you to put into the chat, if you can, whether you've ever been somewhere new that was upsetting for your child. So if you went to the shops and your child's been upset by that, or you've gone to someone else's house, or you've gone to visit somewhere and it's upset your child, if you can just put yes or no into the chat, that would be useful. Now, when you're going somewhere that is new, if you can visit that place first, you can either visit remotely, so you can visit by having a look on the internet at the place, so you've still visited it with the child even though you haven't physically been able to visit. Or you could actually go and visit. So if you knew that you were going to be going to a park, you might, and you were going to be meeting other people at the park. That's a lot for some children. So you might visit that place. Or if it's going to school, leading up to going to school, you might visit the school regularly with your child so that you can support them with that, that new routine and transition. Now, consistency with other people is also something that's really important. So the more consistent everybody is with your child, the easier the routines and transitions will be. So everyone who's in your house, whether there's other adults in your house, other children in your house, if everybody can use the same visual supports and use them in the same way, that's going to be the most effective for your child. So, for example, as I said, if you're going to use a visual of shoes off, and everybody in the house, if you want your child to take the shoes off, everybody uses the same visual, shoes off, and then you take the child's shoes off, then that's going to be easier for your child to start to understand. Rather than doing it, somebody says, oh, take off your shoes. Someone else says shoes off. Someone says, why don't you put your shoes over here? Then that's going to be confusing. If your child visits somewhere else regularly, so grandparents' houses, neighbours' houses, school, or an early childhood centre, if they can all use the same visuals that you are using, then the child has much, much more chance of being able to understand the use of those visuals. So, you know, you might talk to your child's school about creating visuals that you can all use. Obviously, some of those won't be necessary, so a bedtime routine will only be used at home or at other places where your child might sleep. But the things that happen during the day, maybe going to the toilet or having a nappy change, is important for everyone to use the same visuals. Now, unexpected changes can be really, really difficult, and they're difficult for everybody. So, for example, if you needed to go to hospital, you don't necessarily have a social story or you don't have visuals for that. So don't worry about that sort of thing. When unexpected things happen, you can't necessarily control that. But what you can control is something that might make that easier for your child. So, for example, a favourite toy. Now, a way you might prepare, and I just put an example there, is if you know your child absolutely loves a toy and without that toy they're very distressed, you might want to buy a backup toy so that then if that toy gets left on holidays or if it gets left at school, then you have a replacement that's going to support the child until you can get the other one. And the child may or may not know that it's different. If it smells different or seems different, they may know, but it might still bring them some comfort. Just do your best when unexpected things happen and resume the predictable routine as soon as you can. So if you had to go to hospital, then maybe if everyone else in the house can use the visuals in the way that is going to support your child best, then it might be a little hiccup, but everyone just needs to do what they can and resume that routine that's predictable for the children as soon as you can. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop sharing my screen in a moment, and I'm going to answer any questions that you may have. And I will also, when you can see me, then I'll show you these couple of examples that I have also with the visual things. I also just wanted to mention while I was on the screen that there are 2 more workshops that I am going to be doing that may be useful to you if you feel like this is something that is helpful for your child. So the next one that I'm going to be doing, which is actually next, I think it's next weekend, is looking at how to support the sensory needs of your child at home and also how we can translate that into the community as well. And the last one that I will be doing is looking at how you and your other children can play at home with your child of determination. So there are 2 other workshops that I'm going to be doing. So if you think they might be useful to you as well, please go ahead and register for those. So I'm going to stop sharing the screen now, and then we'll have a look at the chat space because I can't see the chat space while I have my screen. So I will just go here to the chat. Okay, you're a very quiet group. Obviously, there's very little in the chat. So I'll just have a look at what here. There's just a question there regarding my child. What do you think is the best way to do our routine every day? Is taking a bath in the body is okay for her, but when the water goes to her head, she's crying a lot. Okay, so obviously the water on her head is very uncomfortable. So I'm hoping that I'm answering your question correctly here. If not, please add another message into the chat. So what might be best for your child is if she finds that putting her head under the water is very, very difficult. Sometimes we don't really know the reasons for the child's response. It can be frustrating for you because you think, well, she has had water on her head since she was little, so it should be okay. But for some reason, it's not okay for her now. Now, this might be one of the sensory kind of things that I'll be talking about in another workshop. But what I would suggest is that if she's distressed by putting water over her head, don't actually put water over her head at this point. So you might bath the rest of her and just use a cloth that's wet to wipe her head. And you might even just even think of, you know, if you want to shampoo her hair, obviously that's very difficult without a lot of water. But you might just need to do your best so that you don't have to put her head under the water. I know that online you can purchase, they were called, when my son was younger, he didn't like having water on his head in the bath, and it was called, I think it was just called a shower hat. And what it was it was like a rim that went around, so you put it on the child's head, so it went around like that. So it was like it had, it was soft, but it stuck out all the way around. So the water, when the water went on the head, the water didn't go in the eyes, which was the problem for my son. It may be that the feeling of the water on her head, she might have different feeling in her head. So it might feel like she's being hit on the head rather than just the water. Or it might be to do with, maybe it might be other things that she feels like she's getting the water in her eyes or in her nose or in her mouth. So you can think about some of the things I've talked about with the visuals, but I'm not sure that that necessarily would be useful for her. I'm thinking trying to see which part of the water being on her head is the most difficult for her. So as I said, if you can tilt her head back and put water on the back part here, and if she's okay with that, then you can get a little bit higher and a little bit higher, but don't let it go near her face. Or if it's just as soon as it goes to here on her head, she's bothered by it, then maybe using a cloth instead. But it could be to do with sensory issues, or she might have frightened herself by putting her face in the water. So there's lots of different reasons why children might have difficulty with that. So does anybody else have any other questions that they would like to put into the chat space for me to answer? So I'll just show you these visuals, and then there's also another handout that I'll just go back and share the screen and refer to, but I just can't see the chat space when I'm on that screen. So when I was talking about the hand washing before and realised that you actually couldn't see me. So here you can see this is a hand washing routine. So this one here has photographs of the sink and the tap, and it says tap on. Then this one has the soap, so push the soap, wash hands. So it's a routine, and this would sit above the sink, or if you want to take it, if you have different places in your house and you want to take the routine, you can see with this one, it actually has the I'll just use that picture. So you can see there, it has the words, it has the photograph, and then it also has a little icon. So when I was talking before too about using like the real objects and then pictures. So if you wanted to see, if you wanted your child to make a choice, for example, do they want to have an apple or some blueberries, then it's the same. You can use visuals in the same way. So you can, of course, hold the apple and hold some blueberries and say, do you want the apple or do you want blueberries? Or if you were somewhere and you thought, oh, I don't know which ones to buy, you might want to use pictures. So here's just some pictures. So apple and blueberries. So you could show your child. Now, if your child isn't verbal, so can't say, oh, I would like to have the apple, what you might do is you might watch where your child's eyes go. And if your child's eyes linger over here, then you can say to them, you keep looking at the apple. So I think it's the apple that you would like to have. So you can use them for this kind of thing. The other thing in relation to routines, and I'm hoping that you'll be able to, these are laminated, so it's a little bit hard with the lighting, but you can see that this kind of one, it says first and then. So this is something you can use just to have 2 steps in a routine. So if, for example, you want your child to, first they have to say they love the bath, but they just try to jump in the bath with their clothes, you might have a picture, and you can use, like have little ones like this with Velcro on them, and you can have a picture of pajamas coming off. And so you might put this one here saying, take your pajamas off, and then you can get in the bath. So you would have a picture here of taking your clothes off, and then a picture here of the bath. So when they've taken their clothes off, you can take that off and you can go, now you can have a bath. So this is handy. What I would normally do with these is just have a Velcro, piece of Velcro here and here. So you can use it for a whole lot of different things. You can use it to, if they want to have a chocolate, but you want them to have an apple first, you can say first you have your apple, and then you'd have a picture of the chocolate, and then you have the chocolate. Or you can have a picture of the apple and you have the wrapper of the chocolate that they like. So so you're trying to think about how you can use these kinds of things that's going to support you in your working with your with your own children. So can anyone think of any other questions that they may have? Please don't be scared to pop the questions in if there is anything that you think of. But what I will do, if you don't have any particular questions, I'm just going to go back to the handouts. So I'll just go through one handout that I haven't shown you. And because I'll be sharing the screen, I won't be able to see your questions. And then I will go and stop sharing the screen so that then I'll be able to see if you have any questions. So I just need to move these handouts back up onto my other screen again. And I'm just going to share the screen, and then I will just talk a little bit about this one that I have here. So this handout here has a whole lot of different websites on it. And the reason that I put this here was because it's really important for you to think about the more information that you get, sometimes the more overwhelming it can be. And you can think to yourself, oh, I really like this social story thing that she was talking about, but I'm still not sure how to create one. So what you might do is you might want to go to the particular site that I had on that slide. So once I've shared my slides, or you can obviously Google these things, but this just gives you a starting point. So here it says how to create and use social stories. So you could then go to this particular one and then go on that link. There's also things there around visual supports, communication tools, establishing routines in the home, using visual supports for infants and toddlers, why routine is important. So that's kind of more background information. And then this one here is tips and ideas for making visuals to support your child if they have some behaviours that you might find challenging. So you can use social stories around behaviours as well, so the expectation of behaviour. But you might also find that you that there's just other things that it talks about in a handout like this that might be useful for you. Does anyone have any questions? I've moved the chat space now so I can see it. It doesn't appear that there's any questions in the chat space. So I'm just going to go to the other one that I referred to before, and I'll go through that. But if there's any questions you have, please just post them and I'm happy to answer the questions. So this one around supporting the transitions throughout the day. So there's a couple of things in here that I want to talk about that I didn't say very much about in the main part of the presentation. So it just tells you that in transition, sometimes this is very difficult for a child. And the first point there says sometimes it's good having a transition object. And what that means is that if there is something that brings your child some comfort, now it might be a toy that, like a train, it might be something like a pen. It might be something like a little piece of material that your child holds, and that brings your child some kind of comfort. Now, when you go from one place to the next, having that particular thing, it's like a security for them. So if they were starting something new, then having that little piece of material or that little toy with them, going from one place to the next can support your child in their transition. So this second point is around the timers that I was talking about. So, you know, you can talk about with your child about tipping the sand glass over, or when the alarm goes off, it's time for lunch, or whatever it is. And the more consistently you do this, the more you will find that the transition becomes really predictable for your child. Slowing things down and not rushing the child, and trying to keep your transitions as minimal as you possibly can. So don't have lots and lots of transitions through the day, because that can make it really hard for the child. So when I talked about visual schedules, this one here just says starting with those 2 steps. So like I said, with the first and then board. Keep your language very minimal for children, because sometimes the too many words can be confusing. So keep it very, very clear what sort of things that you're wanting. So like I said, apple, then chocolate. So you don't need to say, now I need you to eat apple first, and when you've finished eating your apple, I'm going to give you a chocolate. You can say apple, then chocolate. And if you stick with the apple, then chocolate, then that's going to help your child to understand it. So bigger transitions, social stories are really helpful for that sort of thing. I mentioned also something like starting school. If you can drive that routine frequently with the child prior to starting school, that's going to make that easier for your child. The other thing is, if the child has a uniform for school, I'm not sure if you wear uniforms at school, but, you know, or the clothes you're going to want them to wear to school, if they can wear that uniform, practice wearing the uniform. And I'll talk more about this in the sensory workshop next week, because sometimes it's something to do with the material that is uncomfortable for your child, or there's something that actually makes it really hard for your child to put on that new clothing. So where you can, try to prepare your child by letting them take those small steps. So putting the hat on all the time, or wearing the school top all the time. Everyone sticking with the same things I spoke about, and then I also spoke about those unexpected changes. But the more consistent you can be, the more predictable you can be, the easier it's going to be for your child. So what I would suggest is that the next step for you, if you know that the routines can be a little bit challenging for your child, or you know that they struggle with one particular part of the day, what you need to think about is how can you develop some consistency in that routine. So you might think to yourself, my child doesn't have any problem going to bed. They don't have any problem getting dressed. But gee, it's difficult getting them to sit at the table for dinner. Now, it might be something to do with sensory issues that I'll speak about next week, or it might just be that you need to develop more predictability into the routine. So you might need to make sure you're sitting in the same place, that there's a routine that leads up to the dinner, so that the child knows what to expect. So it might be about having dinner at the same time that when a particular show on television finishes, or you read a particular book to your child before dinner, or something happens that leads up to it. So it starts to make dinner time easier for your child, because otherwise that can be very, very confusing for them. So think about the routines. So what I'd suggest is starting by looking at this kind of sheet, or developing your own sheet, and you might want to talk to other people in your house as well. If your child does go to an early childhood centre, or your child goes to a school, you could find out if there's any particular things there that are difficult for your child, and how then you can use some of this knowledge that you've gained about how you might be able to look at incorporating some of these visual things, or developing social stories that would then support your child with that. I understand for some people, and this was something that I have spoken recently to some parents here in Australia about, is that during this kind of pandemic time, there's a lot of difficulty for parents in terms of how unpredictable everything is. And I'm not sure exactly how unpredictable it is for you at the moment, but it's certainly very, it's settled down a little bit here where I am, but it's still very unpredictable, and that can be really hard for any children to understand, because as adults, you already know this is hard for you. So imagine for children, let alone the children who actually struggle with changes in routine or changes in things happening. So you may find that your child is having more difficulty adjusting because the world is less predictable at the moment. So the more things that you can do in the safe place of your home, the more your child will feel comfortable, and the better that your child will cope in that environment. Are there any particular questions that anybody has around the use of visuals, or the use of social stories, or particular parts of your child's routine that are difficult, or anything else that you think that I can assist you with around routines and transitions? I can see the chat space now, so I'm assuming that there are no questions there. Okay, if that's the case, I'm just going to stop sharing my screen for a second. And I'm just going to just take the last few minutes just to talk about some of the things that have been questions that some other people, when I've done similar presentations here in Australia, that some of these questions have arisen. So I'll just take the last few minutes to focus on a couple of the questions that come out of my presentation. So one of the things that people have asked me before is around the use of different timers. You might have a child who actually doesn't like the sound of an alarm or that sort of thing. So in that kind of case, and I can see someone's just raised their hand, so I'll just finish this. So if that's the case, then you need to think about using a timer that doesn't have that sound that will make it difficult for your child. So you might want to use something like the sand timer, or you can create, create something else that's a visual thing that doesn't actually have the sound of the alarm. So you might still be able to use something without the alarm. So I'll just go to the Q&A here. Okay, so this question is, this person has a child who's 6 years old. She understands very well, but she forgets the routine, and I need to remind her daily. Can you advise me if I can use visuals, or is she too old for it? Definitely you can use visuals. So there's not really a particular age where visuals are right or wrong to use. I think the most important thing, as I mentioned earlier, is knowing your child. And if your child is having difficulty with routines, it doesn't actually matter what her age is. So there are adults who have autism who use visuals to help them with routines, because it's hard for them to remember what's part of the routine. And particularly if they're looking at a level of independence, it's very difficult for them. So it's it's absolutely okay for you to do that. It's absolutely okay for you to use visuals, and don't think that there's a restriction on age or anything like that. What you might find though is if you know she understands really well, you might easily be able to go to the kind of cards and things. I don't have a lot of cards with me, but even the making pictures like this, but you might find that you can even make quite small ones that you could keep in your handbag if there's a particular routine that she's forgetting that's outside the home. Or you might be able to get her to take some more responsibility with the routine. So if you had something like, I've got some more, but they're not very accessible here. I'll just show you. So this kind of board here that just has Velcro on it. And if you had the pictures along here, and if these were steps in a routine, so you might have something like this up on your wall, and whichever parts of the routine, I realize this picture the fruit, but if this was part of her routine, and you actually have them on here, so you have them smaller so you can have them along here, or you just have them like as one strip, or you have them as a longer kind of routine that's on the wall, but where she can take responsibility for looking at it and knowing what to do, and then she can take it off and put it away. And then she can look at the next thing and what does she have to do, and then she can take that off and take it away. So she's taking some responsibility in terms of organising her routine, which is very useful as well. And sometimes that gives children some control over their routine, as well as the fact that she can, that hopefully then she will start to learn the routine. So I'm hoping that that has answered your question. Is there anybody else who has any questions? Oh, I can see another one over on the other side. If your child wants chocolate, but I told her first to eat the apple, but she refuses and starts to cry because she wants the chocolate, what would you do? Children are very clever, and if you give in and you give her the chocolate, then next time she will know that if I whinge and I cry, my mum will give me the chocolate. So what I would suggest is that you don't expect her to eat a whole apple before she has the chocolate. So if you want her to have apple and then chocolate, but you might have a picture of, if you might want to have a picture of an apple that's cut up, and you just give her, she has to have one piece of the apple and then she can have the chocolate, and then you can have some more. But if you stick to what you have said, it's just like any other things in relation to parenting. If you say to your child that they can't have it and then you give it to them because they complain or they whinge or they throw themselves on the floor, they will very quickly learn that that what's happened is that if I behave in this way, my behavior is being rewarded. So you need to really avoid that. So try really hard, yes, to do that. So there was somebody else, was there somebody else who raised their hand who had a question? If you'd like to unmute your microphone, if you'd like to ask a question. Was that a different question to the one that was in the question and answer space? If there's someone who actually has a question they'd like to ask, please unmute your microphone. I did answer the question that was in the Q&A, so I'm not sure if that was the same person that raised their hand. Is there anybody else who has a question they would like me to answer? Okay, so our time's almost up. So if you do have additional questions, if you go away and you start to think about this, or you start thinking about this information around the routines, and another question comes to mind, what you can do is you can contact the conference organisers and they will send the questions through to me, and then I can answer your questions. But if you do have a question just before we finish up, can you please unmute your microphone and then you can ask your question. You're very welcome